Hello, good morning. Uh, this is Global NK special interview series. Today I'm a interviewer or moderator of this session. My name is Sung-ho Shin. I'm a professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. And I'm very happy to have my dear friend and colleague all the way from Europe, Professor Pacheco of IR, International Relations Department at King's College London, and he's also Korea Chair at the Vrije University, Brussel School of Governance. And I'm really happy to have you at this time. There are so many things going on in the world, not only in this part of the world, in Seoul and Northeast Asia, but obviously we have a war going on in your part of the world, Europe, which is quite sad, but at the same time it creates a lot of geopolitical dynamics. Recently, everybody was talking about U.S. China competition on the Indo-Pacific region, but suddenly Europe became another hot spot in geopolitics and international relations. And recently we had the NATO summit, in which they published new strategic concept almost in 10 years. And obviously, Russia was the main topic of discussion among all those 30-something leaders from NATO members. But interestingly enough, there was also 4 U.S. allies from this part of the world, Indo-Pacific, including South Korea and Japan and New Zealand and Australia. So I think this is a very, very timely topic, and especially the guest we have here in Seoul, all the way from Europe and Brussels and London. So let me start with the more issue about the Europe itself. So speaking of that new strategic concept, the obvious thing was that it defined clearly Russia as the most significant and direct threat to Europe for obvious reasons. Yet at the same time, the China also was mentioned in NATO document as a systemic challenge. So what does that mean? I mean, how do you interpret why suddenly China becoming a topic of discussion among the European nation, and especially this military alliance focusing on European continent? What is your take?
I think it is fair to say that NATO and Europe as well have become more worried about China over the past 5 to 6 years. I would say three main reasons. One of them, obviously, the rise of China, economic, political, diplomatic, but also military, and obviously this means that there are more frictions with Europe, not necessarily only in the European continent, but also in other parts of the world. So there are, for example, European countries now concerned about the South China Sea because of the trade that goes through this sea lane. There are concerns about competition in places such as Latin America or Africa. And regardless of what we think about Chinese policy, certainly from the perspective of European policymakers and also NATO officials, this has become a challenge that needs to be addressed. There is this perception that China is not as cooperative as it might have been in the 2000s, for example, or even before. But now, a second important reason, I think, it has to do with the U.S. So when it comes to NATO, it was really the U.S. under the previous president, actually, and President Trump, that brought China to discussion in the London summit that we had. For example, in 2019, China was mentioned for the first time. Later, it was mentioned also when President Biden took office, and it really pressed NATO and European countries and the EU as well to consider China from a military perspective, not only from an economic and a political perspective. Some European countries were keen on doing this. The UK, for example, was very keen to support the US. Others in the beginning had more doubts. For example, France at some point, President Macron mentioned NATO should be about the Atlantic, it shouldn't be about the Indo-Pacific. Then he changed his views. So there was this as well. And I think the third reason, in a sense, is that Russia and China are seen by a growing number of European officials and countries as two sides of the same coin. And I think especially with the invasion of Ukraine, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because obviously NATO is the main supporter of Ukraine's fight against Russia. And there's this perception in Europe and in Brussels as well in NATO that China has sided with Russia because it has not condemned Russia, also because of the votes in the United Nations, where China hasn't voted against Russia. So I think that these are the three main factors. There are subsidiary factors, and some European countries have their own reasons. For example, technology, they feel threatened by Chinese technology. But I think these three factors cut across the NATO, but also the European continent.
So yeah, I mean, that's excellent, analysis and interpretation of this event. Yet still, and I can see that you're talking about, especially the China part. I mean, Russia becoming a major threat. I guess there should be no kind of doubt about it, no second thought among both U.S. and NATO members. But still, including China in this important document, I guess there might be some kind of different approach and opinion among, especially between U.S. and other European partners. You mentioned that France, for example, was a little bit, maybe not so eager to have this kind of China part in their own strategic concept. But yeah, here is, I mean, across the world, there are lots of countries that kind of facing the dilemma of having to choose between U.S. and China, even though many of them doesn't want to choose a side, because for obvious reasons. For example, most of country in this world has China is the biggest trading partner, right? Including United States itself, and I guess for many of European countries as well. So, in that sense, designating China as a kind of a threat or challenge, not a threat, that was another, I guess, a very easy decision among the NATO, which is NATO is by definition is a military alliance, right? Yes. So, and recently, right after, I guess, that the NATO summit, China, for example, announced its plan to buy 300, Airbus instead of buying, Boeing jetliner. So I guess there was a kind of Chinese way of responding to this kind of American. So, could you tell a little bit more about this European country kind of facing the American kind of pressure or demand to do something about China, yet at the same time they also have such a very strong economic interest in doing business with China. How do you think, or there might be some difference even among those European countries?
Yes, it is true that differences among European countries. It has to be said that when it came to NATO and the inclusion of China, at some point already last year, it was clear that China was going to be included in the strategic concept. So the question was about what was going to be included in the concept itself. The US, for example, wanted a lengthier section on China, discussing more issues than were actually included, and European countries said, well, we can include cyber, for example, because yes, we have received cyber attacks from China, from Russia, from North Korea as well, so we can include China there. There's this competition in terms of technology, not only military technology, but obviously there's this discussion about supply chains. and from a European perspective, and many European members of NATO agree with this. This is a challenge coming from China that needs to be addressed. So there were certain issues that were not difficult to include because there is an agreement across most European countries. Or there are countries that don't have a strong opinion, but they're part of NATO, so they realize that they have to support this strategic concept. But it is true that maybe originally, if the US had gotten it this way, it would have been a bit more confrontational. And China is labeled a systemic challenge, which is confrontational enough, some would say. But it is true that if you compare the European Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, is different from the American one, and we can talk more about this in more detail later. So there was this discussion within Europe, but at some point there was also a realization, and I think this came already before Russia invaded Ukraine, but this became clearer when Russia invaded Ukraine, that from the perspective of NATO members, since all of them are democracies, there might be questions about some of them how democratic they are, that they had to go to a different level and talk about the ideology as well. And I think that was an important breaking point there, because the moment Europeans start to think about this in terms of ideology, it also became easier for the US to bring together China and Russia and say, well, you have the ideological competition you mentioned with Russia, behaving in a way that hadn't really happened in Europe for many decades now, which is invading another country. Well, China is the same. And even European countries that are more hesitant to say China and Russia are exactly the same, they understood that they could be brought together. And I think that was an important, as I said, breaking point, and that made it easier to have a more open discussion about China. It should be said, the invitation to Korea and the other Asia-Pacific partners, which is the label NATO still uses. There is a question whether now they're calling the Pacific as a result of the strategic concept. But they were already going to be invited before the invasion, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because the invitation was related to China, really. It wasn't related to Russia per se. The discussion about inviting them already goes back to last year, and it was really related to having the four of them. There was a foreign ministers meeting that Korea also attended in April, along with the other three, and actually originally that invitation was related again to China, not necessarily to Russia. So in a sense, everything came together at the same time, but it is true that some European countries, they say, well, we still have to maintain links with China. We don't want to break links with China. We don't want to choose either. The same Europe is the so-called Sinatra doctrine that many have used, right? The idea that Europe can go its own way. But having said that, when it comes to U.S. China competition, but at the same way, Europeans are very clear, and Secretary General Stoltenberg has said this from a NATO perspective, but also Borrell from a European perspective, the equivalent to the foreign minister, right? High Representative for Foreign Affairs, he has actually said that even though if we want to implement our own policy, because of our own long-standing ties with the US and because of ideology, we're going to lean towards the US. It's not that we're going to make a choice, but naturally we're going to be closer to the US than China. And I think increasingly you see more and more European countries buying this argument, following this argument, saying, well, we don't want to choose, but if there's going to be a confrontation between the US and China, clearly we're going to be on the US camp, and we're going to be working together with the US without breaking links with China, but understanding that unless under the current leadership and the way Xi Jinping has been moving Chinese foreign policy direction, has been moving towards, right, from a European perspective, something that is incompatible with Europe. And you have to mention EU, NATO, and European countries together, because really the conversation tends to be NATO and the EU have been cooperating more and more. The conversation tends to be really between the two institutions plus EU member states that are also NATO members, right? So this has to be understood that Europe sometimes can be treated as a whole when it comes to this aspect of foreign policy. One last issue is that with China now becoming more involved, more prominent, obviously, in Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, and Asian affairs from a security perspective, European countries having good relations with Korea, with Japan, with Australia as well, if we move beyond Asia, with Singapore as well, the concerns that sometimes you hear coming from Seoul, from Tokyo, right? This perception that maybe China is trying to withdraw some of the geopolitics of the region. This resonates in Europe, right? Because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, right? So there's this equivalence that some European countries make, or most of them actually make the same. Well, maybe what China is trying to do in Asia, redraw the map of Asia, some people say maybe potentially invading Taiwan in the future. Well, it's what Russia is trying to do. So there's this, some European countries feel this moral obligation to support Asian partners as well. And sometimes this means taking a tougher stance against China, because the perception is that this is what Asian partners, or Indo-Pacific partners, if you include Australia, actually want as well.